If you had to guess who would win in a possible war between Bolivia and Paraguay, you would probably pick Bolivia. You would be right, as there is no way the tiny and insignificant Paraguay can defeat Bolivia, right? Welcome to the Chaco War, where Paraguay did the impossible and Bolivia lost yet another war since their creation. This war lasted for almost 3 years, and it saw more than 100,000 casualties. To add insult to injury, this conflict was the bloodiest in South America in the 20th century, and it was fought between two of its poorest countries. Bolivia lost 2% of their total population, with Paraguay losing 3%. But why did the two countries fight over the Chaco province? And what would happen if Bolivia won the Chaco War? How does this event change South America and the Second World War? Let's find out. The Chaco province itself is not so important. There were minor oil discoveries in the region, so it was thought to contain a lot of oil, but this wasn't the case. What is more important is the Paraguay River running across the province. This is important because this river flows to the Atlantic Ocean. Controlling it would mean access to world trade. This was very important both to Bolivia and Paraguay, as both countries were landlocked. Remember this fact, as when the war started, both countries struggled to import arms due to the lack of access to the world's oceans. History for Bolivia and Paraguay has been rough. Paraguay started the deadliest war in South America, the War of the Triple Alliance, where they lost half of their territory. As for Bolivia, they were on the decline ever since their creation, losing the War of the Pacific, then the Acre conflict, and now they were defeated by Paraguay. Bolivia and Paraguay couldn't agree on the ownership of the Chaco province, as both had legitimate reasons to claim it as theirs. As oil was discovered, many oil companies started drilling in the area, with different oil companies supporting their preferred country's claims to the area. Standard Oil, who supported Bolivia, allegedly funded the country's build-up for a war, but the Bolivian government decided on their own to declare the war on Paraguay. An important fact to mention is that Argentinian wealthy people owned substantial amount of the land in the disputed area. This resulted in Argentina supporting Paraguay, resulting in their victory, but this could have very well been changed. As Bolivia was profiting from their mining industry, they felt confident that the government can fund the war for a couple of months. The Bolivians thought that this conflict was going to be an easy one, as Bolivia's population outnumbered the one of Paraguay 3-1. Paraguay's response to the Bolivian rearmament was the reason why they were victorious, as they were able to purchase equipment from the First World War from countries like Spain, France, Denmark and the United States. French officers even trained Paraguayan troops, teaching them tactics from the First World War. There were some initial clashes in the late 1920s. Bolivian soldiers took Paraguayan soldiers hostage and apparently murdered the Paraguayan lieutenant Adolfo Rojas Silva. This event resulted in Paraguay sending in their army, who took 21 Bolivian soldiers hostage and burned their outposts. There were many border clashes after this incident, meaning that the war could have started more than 10 years earlier than in our timeline. The reason why it didn't is because neither country had any weapons or resources to fight a war, so they waited until they could receive foreign support. On the 15th of June 1932, the war started, as Bolivian detachment captured and burnt a Paraguayan base, which later became known as the Pitian Tuta Lake incident. The territory was later recovered by the Paraguayan military. As a response to the incident, Bolivian President Daniel Salamanca ordered the capture of a couple of outposts. These operations were successful, so the Bolivians had high hopes of victory, without much resistance. They were wrong. Paraguay also gave its general staff orders to recapture these army outposts. By that time, both sides had mobilized around 10,000 soldiers on each side, so they were pretty much even in terms of manpower. For the Bolivians, it was a hard choice on what they should do next. This is because the Chaco province was very sparsely populated. Supplying the Bolivian army inside was very tricky. This meant that the Bolivians couldn't push too fast, as they would risk getting their supply cut off. On the other hand, if they were too slow, the Paraguayan army would fully mobilize and build fortifications. The Bolivians chose to be quick about it, as they underestimated Paraguay's defensive capabilities. The Bolivian reinforcements in the Chaco province suffered from several problems. The main problem is that the army had to walk for hundreds of miles. This is because there wasn't any rail or trucks that can be used to transport the army. This resulted in a large percentage of the army ceasing to exist even before reaching the battlefield. Paraguay didn't suffer from the same problems, as they had to defend the territory only a couple of miles from their core territory, which had railroads leading up to it. At the town of Boquerón, the Paraguayans managed to besiege it and capture around 1,000 Bolivian soldiers, taking them prisoners. The Bolivians sent an army to relieve the besieged fortifications, but they were destroyed and never successfully completed their mission. A German World War I veteran resided in Bolivia, and he was tasked with helping the Bolivian South in this war. Maybe that's the reason why they lost, as they took German advice which didn't work out in the end for the Germans in the Great War. The plan of Hans Kunt was to take control of the southern Chaco and put the Paraguayan capital at risk of being captured. This would most likely secure a military victory, or the Paraguayan government would negotiate. Hans Kunt was perhaps more confident than what he should have been, as he declared that the war would be over in 3 months, with Bolivia coming out on top. The war ended up taking a bit less than 3 years. Paraguay, on the other hand, had good intelligence and they knew about the upcoming attacks. The country also had former World War I veterans of their own, most of them from Tsarist Russia. In January 1933, the Bolivians started their own offensive. The goal was to capture Fort Nanava, which was considered by the Paraguayan military as the backbone of their defenses. This resulted in the Paraguayan side defending it fearlessly, which helped them secure a victory. Had Bolivia won here, they just might be able to secure a total victory early in the war. 6 months later, the same offensive was attempted, but this time there were Bolivian bomber planes who destroyed many parts of the concrete fortifications. The Bolivian attack also included artillery, airplanes, tanks and flamethrowers. So, did they win? Well, you're not going to believe this, but no, they lost anyways. The reason for that is that Paraguay had improved their fortifications in these 6 months leading up to the Bolivian offense. This event resulted in the Bolivian president to criticize the Bolivian High Command and order them to spare more men. Hans Kunt tried to resign, but he was not allowed by the president. In September of 1933, Paraguay was the one who was beating their enemy. The Paraguayan side drew plans to create 3 encirclements. While this plan was ambitious, it actually worked, as 2 of the encircled fortifications surrendered, but one was relieved and broke the siege. This resulted in the Paraguayans capturing not only the soldiers in the encirclement, but most importantly, their equipment, which I would argue is more advanced than the one that Paraguay previously had. By then, Paraguayan forces had captured so many Bolivian tanks that Paraguay had the armor advantage. These quick successes made the Bolivian side give up their plans of taking the Paraguayan capital, so they decided to stick to defensive tactics and war of attrition. This went on for around a year, but the Paraguayans finally had a decisive victory at Fort El Carmen. This Bolivian defeat forced the army to retreat to Villa Montes, where the president went to visit the headquarters. There, the Bolivian army generals confronted the president and forced him to resign, replacing him with his vice president. In April of 1935, Paraguay reached the core borders of Bolivia and started taking pre-war territory of Bolivia. Both sides were exhausted, resulting in a peace treaty. Paraguay had controlled most of the Chaco province, resulting in them keeping 3/4 of the territory. Bolivia wrongly assumed that their technological and numerical superiority would be enough to win the war, which wasn't the case. On the other hand, Paraguay compensated their lack of resources with superior tactics, resulting in their victory. I already hinted that Bolivia could have been victorious at the first battle of Nanoa. In the second battle, they used all of this advanced equipment, but by that time, Paraguay was ready. What if Bolivia used all of their equipment the first time? Even with advanced Paraguayan intelligence, they would most likely still lose. The Bolivian army would simply chase the enemy and the capital city of Paraguay would be reached. All of this would happen just 6 months after the beginning of the conflict, which wouldn't allow for Paraguay to have any initiative in the war. They would simply have to respond to Bolivia's counterattacks. I would assume that all of the Bolivian artillery and airplanes would start bombing the Paraguayan capital city, resulting in their surrender. In the peace treaty, Bolivia would keep the Chaco province in its entirety, while also requesting heavy war reparations from Paraguay. The small and defeated South American nation would suffer from the same problems as Bolivia did in our timeline. This is an arms embargo. This would be until Argentina allows Paraguay to use their ports to import arms. Considering that Paraguay was defeated and they were supported by ultranationalist countries like Argentina and Italy, I think that it's fair to say that Paraguay would become ultranationalists themselves, rather than communists. When the German Reich rises to power, they would sign friendship treaties both with Argentina and Paraguay. When the Second World War starts, nothing will change initially. This is until Peru invades Ecuador in early July 1941, a couple of weeks after Germany started their own invasion of the Soviet Union. Historically, Peru managed to defeat Ecuador in not even a month, but this time, let's spice it up a bit. We're turning this scenario into something that is not realistic, but it allows us to start a massive war in South America. Paraguay and Argentina would demand that the Peruvian advances stop and that an immediate peace treaty is signed, to which Peru would refuse. This would make Argentina and Paraguay join the Axis and declare war on Peru. According to this map, there was a lot of German influence present in Chile as well. The Chileans previously gave up the Tacna province to Peru as a sign of goodwill. Now they would be willing to take it back. Bolivia would either be attacked or join voluntarily to defend their sort of an ally of Peru. This would result in both Peru and Bolivia joining the Allies. Peru's government could be considered ultranationalist, so them joining the Allies is unrealistic, I will admit. Historically, Brazil joined the Second World War in January 1942, 6 months after this alternate conflict in South America. Ecuador would capitulate quickly. Despite the mountainous terrain, they would be too isolated. Peru and Bolivia would start losing ground quickly to the Axis countries. A continuation of the Chaco War would begin between Bolivia and Paraguay, but this time both countries had allies. When Brazil joins the war in January 1942, the tides of the war in the continent might change. Maybe this war escalates to include Venezuela and Colombia, meaning that all of South America would be at war, except Uruguay and Chile. A more realistic option is that these countries don't join, at least not initially, which means a slow and bloody decline for the Axis powers in South America. Over in Europe, the Germans would still lose, meaning that the Allied powers would be victorious in the South American continent. In the peace treaty, I would assume that Bolivia and Peru would slightly grow in size, with Paraguay being puppeted by Brazil. As for Argentina, I assume that they would lose their province of Mesopotamia, and it would be awarded to the Brazilian puppet state of Paraguay. Just for the memes, Paraguay and Uruguay would finally border each other. Jokes aside, this new state would serve as a buffer between Argentina and Brazil, meaning that the two countries no longer share a common border. The continent of South America finally becomes interesting with this video. Let me know in the comments if you liked it. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.